There are places in the world under pressure, and then there's Bangladesh, a country where that pressure becomes something else entirely. Too many people, too little space, too many systems pushed far past what they were built to handle. And when everything starts straining at once, the air, the water, the roads, the economy, the very ground beneath people's feet, the result doesn't look like a normal crisis. It looks like something that shouldn't exist in the modern world. But what we're about to break down goes way deeper than what most people realize. Because this isn't just a story about overcrowding or poverty. This is about what happens when an entire nation is forced to operate beyond the limits of what any system can sustain. We're talking about air so toxic it shaves years off people's lives. An economy where children work in the same kilns that are poisoning their lungs. A global supply chain that depends on conditions that most of the world pretends don't exist. And the numbers behind all of it are some of the most extreme we've ever covered on this channel. We're going to show you exactly why. Starting with how 177 million people got crammed into a space that can barely hold them. And ending with a global bargain that most of the world benefits from, but nobody wants to talk about. Let's get into it. Bangladesh is home to roughly 177 million people. That alone is staggering. That's more than Germany and France combined, packed into a country about the size of Iowa. But the number that really tells the story is this: around 1,350 people per square kilometer of land area. That makes Bangladesh one of the most densely populated nations on the planet. And we're not talking about a city-state like Singapore or Monaco. This is a full-sized country with farmland, rivers, and coastline crammed to the edge of what geography can physically hold. And nowhere is that compression more visible than in the capital. Dhaka's metropolitan area holds over 36 million people, and it's growing by an estimated 500,000 every single year. Now, most of these arrivals are rural migrants, fleeing floods, river erosion, or simply searching for any kind of work. Around 30% of Dhaka's population lives in slums. Only about 7% of the city is covered by roads. And according to the World Bank, traffic congestion in Dhaka causes an estimated 3.2 million working hours to be lost every day. Not per month, not per year, every single day. More than a quarter of the city's inhabitants live in slum conditions, and pollution levels continue to climb. That's not a traffic problem, that's an entire economy bleeding out through gridlock, while the people stuck in it can barely breathe. Dhaka receives roughly 2,000 new arrivals every day. Think about that rhythm. The city doesn't grow in waves, it grows constantly, like a pressure valve that only moves in one direction. And the housing stock, the water supply, the electricity grid, the waste management, none of it can keep pace. The result is a city where basic services are in permanent deficit, where the informal economy fills gaps that the formal system can't, and where millions of people navigate conditions that would qualify as an emergency anywhere else except here. It's just Tuesday. Now multiply that pressure across the entire country, because in Bangladesh, even the land itself is working against you. Bangladesh sits on the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta, one of the largest and most dynamic river systems on the planet. The country has roughly 700 rivers threading through it. Now that sounds like abundance, but in a living delta, it's also a guarantee of instability. Channels shift, embankments collapse, floodplains swallow entire villages, and none of this is a surprise. It happens with seasonal certainty every single year. Here's the number that should stop everyone in their tracks. 2/3 of Bangladesh sits less than 15 feet above sea level. For reference, Lower Manhattan ranges from about 7 to 13 feet. Now stretch that kind of vulnerability across an entire nation of 177 million people, and you begin to understand why Bangladesh isn't just at risk from climate change. It's one of the front lines. In May of 2024, Cyclone Remal slammed into the coastal regions, impacting an estimated 18 million people in a single event, destroying over 35,000 homes and leaving 2.7 million without electricity. That same year's monsoon flooding in the north displaced over 100,000 more, wiping out homes, infrastructure, and rice fields across entire districts. And this isn't an anomaly. This is the baseline. The World Bank projects that by 2050, up to 19.9 million Bangladeshis could become internal climate migrants. That's not speculation. That's modeling based on sea level rise, flooding frequency, and agricultural collapse already underway. And Bangladesh's relationship with disaster, it's not just environmental, it's foundational. The Bola cyclone of 1970 killed between 300 and 500,000 people, one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. But what followed was even more significant. The Pakistani government's catastrophic failure to respond helped ignite the political unrest that led directly to Bangladesh's War of Independence. Disaster didn't just shape the geography here, it shaped the nation's very existence. And that pattern, extreme weather creating political rupture, has echoed through every decade since. Even in 2024, the country wasn't just battling storms, it was navigating political upheaval, a student-led uprising that toppled the government of Sheikh Hasina in July, followed by an interim administration and eventually a general election in February of 2026. All of it unfolding against a backdrop of cyclones, floods, and the grinding reality that the country's physical environment keeps getting harder to survive in. But here's where the system starts cracking under the weight. When you compress that many people into that little of a space, then layer climate chaos on top, every piece of infrastructure gets pushed past its breaking point. And in Dhaka, the cracks are impossible to ignore. The capital doesn't have a functioning citywide sewerage system, a megacity of over 25 million people, and sewage management is still overwhelmingly informal. A World Bank program document describes the urban region as marked by serious service gaps and rising flood exposure, with drinking water supply, sewerage, and storm drainage all flagged as core intervention priorities. Canals and drains that are supposed to carry rainwater double as waste channels, meaning that during floods, sewage and stormwater become the same thing, spreading contamination through entire neighborhoods. And the people who keep the system from total collapse are almost completely invisible. Manual sewer cleaners, men who enter manholes and drainage systems without safety equipment, working in darkness, surrounded by toxic gases and human waste, earning just a few dollars a day. They keep cities like Dhaka functioning. And the practice continues because Bangladesh, well, they still lack the infrastructure and political will to modernize its sanitation systems at the scale that the population demands. Above ground, the rivers tell the same story from a different angle. Waterways that once sustained entire communities, feeding families, supporting fishing economies, providing transport, have been transformed by decades of industrial discharge, untreated sewage, and chemical dumping. In some stretches, the water runs completely black, covered in industrial foam so thick that the surface looks solid. The smell of chemicals is strong enough that people cover their faces when crossing bridges. Fish populations have vanished entirely from sections that supported generations of fishermen. And it's not just livelihoods that have been destroyed. People who still use these rivers for daily needs, washing, cooking, drinking, face constant exposure to dangerous chemicals and bacteria that drive epidemic levels of waterborne diseases. Families that fish the same waters for generations now face unemployment and hunger because the rivers their ancestors relied on are too toxic to support any form of life. Many of those families end up doing the only thing they can, migrating to Dhaka, adding yet more pressure to a city already bursting at the seams. The system's not broken, it's overloaded. And when systems get overloaded, the effects start spreading into places you just wouldn't expect. Hey, if you're finding this breakdown valuable, subscribe to Fall of Nations, because what comes next is where these pressures start feeding into each other, and the numbers are genuinely some of the most disturbing we've ever reported. Here's the fact that changes the entire picture. According to a 2024 World Bank country environmental analysis, air pollution, unsafe water, poor sanitation, and lead exposure together cause over 272,000 premature deaths in Bangladesh every single year, alongside 5.2 billion days of illness. And it's not just adults. Lead poisoning alone is causing irreversible damage to children's brain development, with an estimated 20 million IQ points lost across the population every year. The economic cost of all that damage, an estimated 17.6% of the country's GDP, according to the World Bank report from 2024. Not 2%, not 5%, but nearly a fifth of everything the economy produces is consumed by environmental destruction. And air pollution is the single biggest killer in that equation, driving roughly 55% of all those premature deaths. Bangladesh was ranked the most polluted country in the world in 2025, with an average PM 2.5 concentration of 66.1 micrograms per cubic meter, according to the 2025 World Air Quality Report. The World Health Organization's guideline is 5. That's not double, not triple, that's more than 13 times the safe limit. During the dry winter months from November to March, those levels can spike to 2 or 3 times higher than the annual average. Dhaka regularly competes for the title of the most polluted city on the planet, trading that distinction with Delhi, Beijing, and Lahore depending on the week. The Air Quality Life Index estimates that particulate pollution alone reduces the life expectancy of the average Bangladeshi by about 5.5 years. In Dhaka, that figure climbs to nearly 7 years of life erased by the air. And the source of that pollution tells its own brutal story. Bangladesh lacks natural stone aggregate for construction, so building depends heavily on bricks. And those bricks come from thousands of traditional coal-burning kilns. A World Bank study identifies them as major contributors to hazardous urban air pollution and a significant source of carbon emissions. The cycle's vicious and self-reinforcing. Urban growth demands bricks, bricks demand kilns, kilns poison the air, and the poisoned air subtracts years from the very population driving that growth. In Bangladesh, development and pollution aren't opposites, but rather partners. But the damage doesn't stop at what people breathe. It reaches into the lives of the most vulnerable people in the country. UNICEF's primary findings from Bangladesh's 2025 national survey found that child labor now involves 9.2% of children aged 5 to 17, up from 6.8% in 2019. That increase represents an estimated 1.2 million more children pulled into work. And the brick kiln sector, the very same industry that's choking the air, is one of the worst offenders, absorbing cheap, vulnerable child labor at industrial scale. The International Labor Organization has documented the hazards in detail: extreme heat, toxic exposure, weak regulation, and virtually no protective equipment. The kiln becomes a symbol. That same industry that builds the city can consume the bodies of the children who will inherit it. Nearly half of all girls in Bangladesh, around 47% according to the latest survey data, are married before they turn 18. That figure has improved from 51% in 2019, but the base rate remains one of the highest in the world. In some rural areas, the pressure is even more intense. Families treat marriage as an economic decision, a way to reduce household costs and secure an alliance. The result is girls whose futures are decided before they've finished school. And violence follows that same structural line. A 2024 government survey found that 3 of 4 women had experienced at least one form of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Under sustained economic and social pressure, private life becomes another front line, especially where stigma and underreporting bury the full scale of harm. Even something as basic as moving through public space carries real danger. The World Health Organization estimates over 31,000 road traffic fatalities in Bangladesh in 2021, a figure far higher than official crash records suggest. Buses, decades old, packed well beyond capacity, passengers clinging to rooftops, rickshaw drivers pedaling through scorching heat for wages that can barely cover their own survival. In a country where daily movement is essential for economic survival, road risk becomes another hidden tax on life, paid disproportionately by the poorest and by the people who have no other way to get work. And this is the part that makes Bangladesh's story different from any other crisis that we've covered. Because everything we've just described, the density, the pollution, the failing infrastructure, the pressure on the most vulnerable, all of it exists inside a country that is simultaneously one of the most important manufacturing hubs on the planet. Bangladesh isn't just grinding under its own internal pressures, it's wired directly into the global economy, and the terms of that deal are brutal. Bangladesh is the world's second largest garment exporter after China. In the 2024-2025 fiscal year, the ready-made garment sector earned $39.35 billion, roughly 81.5% of the country's total export income. Around 4 million people work directly in garment factories, with millions more dependent on the sector's broader ecosystem. This isn't a side industry, it's the economic spine of the entire nation. But the model runs on a razor's edge. When global brands demand lower prices and faster turnaround, the pressure doesn't absorb at the corporate level. It travels downward, into overtime, into wage suppression, into corners cut on safety and compliance. The minimum wage for a garment worker was set at 12,500 Dhaka, roughly $105 a month. Women make up the majority of the workforce. For many, the factory floor offers income and social mobility that didn't exist a generation ago. But it also concentrates young women, often migrants from poorer rural regions, into environments where long hours, harassment, and precarious housing become the cost of entry into wage labor. The result isn't a simple story of empowerment or exploitation, it's both, locked together in the same system. Bangladesh didn't invent this model. It entered a global system designed to reward exactly this arrangement: cheap labor, thin margins, maximum output. And the world's closets are full of the evidence. Every fast fashion haul, every bargain price t-shirt, every global brand that boasts about affordable style. Well, there's a high probability that somewhere in that supply chain, the math only works because someone in Bangladesh absorbed the cost. But the country's bargain with the global economy doesn't end at the factory floor. There's an even more dangerous version playing out along the coast. Near Chattogram, end-of-life ships from around the world are brought ashore and torn apart, largely by hand. The shipbreaking yards at Sitakunda are among the largest in the world. Workers, many of them migrants from the country's poorest rural districts, use basic tools like hammers and blowtorches to break down vessels that were built to withstand the worst storms at sea. The process recovers steel and valuable materials, but it's been described by the International Labor Organization as among one of the most dangerous occupations on Earth. Workers face exposure to asbestos, heavy metals, lead paint, and toxic chemicals, often with no protective gear. Fatalities and chronic illnesses aren't exceptions. They're built into the economics of the operation. And many workers don't even know what materials they're handling or how dangerous the exposure really is. And the global logic makes it worse. Dismantling ships safely is expensive, so the system creates powerful incentives to shift that work to places where labor is cheap and regulation is thin. The International Maritime Organization's Hong Kong Convention, designed to make ship recycling safer, was adopted in 2009. It only entered into force in June of 2025. 16 years for regulation to catch up with a hazard that the entire world already knew existed. Shipbreaking isn't a local oddity. It's a mirror held up to global consumption. Modern economies enjoy the benefits of maritime trade, and the end-of-life cost of that trade, the contaminated beaches, broken bodies, hazardous waste, lands in places like Bangladesh. And this is where all of it converges. No single problem creates what Bangladesh is experiencing right now. Not the density, not the flooding, not the pollution or the garment economy, or even the shipbreaking yards or crumbling infrastructure. Taken alone, each of these pressures would strain any country on Earth. But Bangladesh doesn't face them alone. It faces them all at once. Layered, interacting, amplifying. Density magnifies every infrastructure failure into a public crisis. Climate displacement feeds urban overcrowding. Overcrowding overwhelms sanitation. Failed sanitation poisons water. Polluted air shortens lives. Shortened lives deepen poverty. And poverty keeps the entire cycle locked in place. This is a trap that makes Bangladesh different from a country that's dealing with one crisis at a time. There's no single lever to pull, no single reform that fixes it, because every pressure is connected to every other one. And trying to solve one without addressing the others only shifts the weight somewhere else in the system. The system doesn't collapse from a single shock. It strains because the pressure never stops accumulating, and there's almost no margin left. One bad monsoon season, one global demand shift, one more degree of warming, that's all it would take to push conditions from extreme to untenable. So why does Bangladesh feel like one of the most extreme places on Earth right now? Not because of one disaster, not because of one failing system, but because everything, the density, climate, economy, infrastructure, the air itself, is running at the edge, all at once. And when a country of 177 million people operates beyond what the system can handle, day after day, year after year, the result isn't a dramatic collapse. It's sustained, compounding pressure that reshapes what daily life looks like for an entire nation. And yet, within all of this, life continues. People adapt. Informal economies fill the gaps. Migration networks form. Communities build survival systems out of almost nothing. That resilience is real, and it deserves respect, but resilience can also become a trap. Proof that people can endure almost anything, and therefore an excuse for the rest of the world to tolerate conditions that should never be normal. That's what's happening in Bangladesh, and it shouldn't be this way. So what do you think? Is this a failure of Bangladesh's own systems, or a consequence of how the global economy was designed? And what happens when the pressure finally exceeds what the system can hold? Let us know in the comments, and if this is your first time here, subscribe to Fall of Nations. We break down the forces that reshape countries and the world every single week.